Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Friday, the 22nd of March, 2024. I am Delbridge, Benchmark Realty, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. This is your weekly status chat. Now, I have 4 tabs open today that we're going to look at, and you can find each one of these tabs in your description over on your status chat in the YouTube area where we post these things. So you can look these things up and read them in entirety. I tend to run long if I have more than one tab. Sometimes even if I have just the one, I've got 4 to cover, so let's get right to it. If you like this content, please go to CallDelToSell.com, find the tab that says on YouTube, click it, and it'll open up a page of QR codes. There you can use a smartphone to scan and get to the YouTube page, or you can just mouse over and click it on a PC. There you'll be able to subscribe to this little button over here and click the notification bell so that YouTube will notify you when each Friday's blog has been uploaded. Thank you. And let me start by rehashing something we've talked about in the past. We have a problem in the macroeconomics. When you use the cost of money, Fed rates, the central bank rates, you can either fight a weak economy with lowering interest rates. We only lower interest rates if we're trying to get people to hold on to employees or reinvest, or to get that cost of money, maybe refinance some debt that they have. So we have lower interest rates when the economy is not doing well. In general, that's when we would lower those rates to speed up the economy. So when the Fed raises rates, it's a bad idea. It's a bad day. When the Fed lowers rates, it's even worse, because that normally means recession or slowing economy, something like that. We raise rates to actually slow down people's purchasing in the stimulated economy. We want people not to spend as much. So we raise the cost of spending by raising the cost of borrowing and debt, and that slows it down. And we've got an inflationary problem. We know this. So here's the problem. You can't be in 2 places at once. It's very, very hard to raise the cost of money through the Fed rate, decrease the money supply. We call it quantitative tightening if the Fed takes it in. We call it quantitative easing if the Fed is basically printing out the money. Because there's more money flowing and there's more velocity of money printing that money, we call it quantitative easing. Perhaps you remember when Obama was talking about quantitative easing, he had caused a problem with his economy and he wanted to overcome it by printing more money. And he did. And that's part of the reason why some of the rates were as low as they were. And then people like that low cost of money, and we just kept them down low for too long. And what happens with housing? We're payment driven in this nation. We buy as much house as the bank will give us the money for. So when we had normal rates anywhere from 6 to 8%, somewhere in that range, we bought a certain type of house and we enjoyed it. It gave us a mortgage of a certain size. And then when rates fell, we still bought a house with a mortgage of that same size as far as the monthly payment, but the money was cheap, so we bought more than really we would have normally been able to buy. That's our problem now. It's a little harder now to sell that house on top of its gain depreciation, the inflation that's put on it, the increased demand that's put on it. It's hard to find people that can get that money. Now, if we lower the interest rate, that helps to a degree, but what about inflation raising the top of it? So let's look at this first panel. CNBC. Federal Reserve, Jeff Cox, Dateline day before yesterday, Fed holds rates steady and maintains 3 cuts are coming sometime this year. Now, the instantaneous response to this was the stock markets jumped. They loved hearing that we're definitely getting 3 rates later this year. They liked that, but he didn't tell us when. So the Fed speaks with rumors, but he doesn't actually do something. And yet the markets move in the direction we want them to go. So I think he's going to try that for a while, because I think unemployment in the economy is weakening. So he hasn't given up his rate. At the same time, all he's done is saying we're definitely going to go to 3 later this year. But didn't say when. He had previously been talking about when. Do you remember? Q3. And in December, somehow all of the experts, all of the super salesman type people convinced them that they were going to have 7 cuts this year, and they were going to start even in the first quarter, possibly, definitely the second quarter, possibly, and the Fed never said anything ahead of the third quarter. We may actually see it in the last quarter, because he can still keep his word and give 3 rate cuts in the last 3 meetings. Following a 2-day policy meeting, the central bank's rate setting Federal Open Market Committee said it will keep its benchmark overnight borrowing rate in the range between 5.25 to 5.5. In other words, just what we expected. Not going to do anything. The Fed's good at doing nothing because they don't want to do something too fast. Along with the decision, Fed officials penciled in 3/4 percentage points cut by the end of 2024, which would be the first rate reduction since the days of the COVID pandemic in March of 2020. And you see what it said. By the end of, they didn't reiterate Q3, they said by the end of, definitely, but we lost more of the timing certainty when they did this. And so that's what we got going on there. And it gets a little bit more sketchy down here, and I can't really go through too much of this. I'll spend the whole show on this, but I want to get down to this potential pivot that they're going to do. They're starting to soften the idea that they may go from QT, quantitative tightening, trying to get money back out of the system into the Fed's balance sheet, and the rate cuts that they would need to maybe stave off household bankruptcies in credit card debt or car loans or housing or wherever it might be, wherever household debt may be getting out of hand. So he might be wanting to throw a little bit of a bone that way, but we're still fighting inflation. We haven't got inflation taken care of. So he's almost suggesting that at the end of the year, we're going to be done messing with inflation. So this first little bit, they talk about the dot plot here. What a dot plot is, if you don't know, is the committee is made out of different members from the different heads of each of the Federal Reserve banks in the areas. And each of those persons then brings, in the beige report that we've covered before, brings back an idea. This is what's going on in my neighborhood. And this is where I think interest rates need to be in terms of the Fed rate, the target rate. That's where I think they need to be. And they all tell it. And then you get to see kind of a scatter plot of where each of these banking officials thinks it needs to be based upon their conditions. So that's what a dot plot is. So they're talking about that. And they said, really, we're not really seeing a whole lot of things change there. Not enough that it will change our timing of the move. So this right here, the chart provides no indication for the timing of the move. So they're kind of indicating at the same time, definitely 3, don't know when, we're not committing, we may not hold that Q3 estimation. And I'm going to slide on down here till I can find it. Bear with me. Here we go. The FOMC's post-meeting statement was almost identical to the one delivered in its last meeting in January, save for an upgrade on its job growth assessment to strong from the January characteristics that gains were moderate. The decision to stand pat on rate was approved unanimously. Now, what's important about that statement is if jobs are actually very strong, we don't really need to worry in some respects as much about cutting those rates. Because if we can keep rates where they are and we still hold on to jobs, we don't have to worry about unemployment, which would trigger bankruptcies and a lot of other things for some number of people, and which would signal bad jobs is a signal that we're in recession. So here they just said we actually have a stronger job growth, although I'm not really sure where they got that from. When I looked at the household surveys, the institutional study was saying jobs were good, but the household study where we look at people wasn't so bright. Markets have been watching closely for clues about where the Fed would go from here with its monetary policy. All right, so there's something lower down here talking about the balance sheet. Let me go ahead and pull it up before I switch the screen. Beyond that, markets also were looking for some direction on the Fed's balance sheet reduction program. There you go. Are we going to shift from QT, quantitative tightening, bringing in the money supply, or are we going to go to quantitative easing, which is letting the money supply expand to get more economic activity? Don't know. They're just now beginning to talk about that. So let's look at our next little screen I have here. I won't take long with that. Let's pull it up here. This is CNBC, Asia Economy. This was on the 19th. It was earlier this week. The Bank of Japan just made a historic rate pivot, because that's what we're talking about in America, talking about the rate pivot from tightening to easing, from raising Fed rates to lowering Fed rate. Here's what could happen next. And oh, I didn't give credit. Mr. Clement Tan and Liam Hu Jae. I'm sorry about that, Mr. J. Bank of Japan governor, I'm going to skip his name, had repeatedly said these talks would be key to sustainable price increases that would inform any decision to hike rates for the first time in 17 years. Go to the second bullet point. Bank of Japan policymakers expect higher salaries to lead to a virtuous spiral with domestic demand fueling inflation. All right, let's click it one more tab over. So Japan actually raised rates while the Swiss central bank cuts rates, here in a surprise move, getting ahead of global peers. This seems to suggest, Reuters seems to suggest, Mr. John Revelle of Reuters on March 21st, yesterday, seems to be suggesting that the Swiss bank is expecting recession hard enough they're trying to get their rates down low quicker before anyone else. Surprise rate cut sends franc lower, which would be equivalent to the dollar when our rates go lower. A lot of times the dollar does too. Boost equities, lowers inflation forecast, allowed bank to cut rate. That is, if we believe that global inflation is under control. In America, we've seen it's been ticking up, not down. So if the Fed moves from working and worried about inflation to worrying about economy, that to me says that we're more likely to hit harder times than we are better times. So your question, if you want to sell or buy, we'll look at the very next tab. But it's going to boil down to, if inflation continues to go up, your house is built with stuff, filled with stuff, made with stuff keeps costing more money, houses are going to tend to want to be sticky on the higher end. But if the economy crashes and you lose your job and you can't pay your credit cards and you can't pay your mortgage and you end up with a bankruptcy or foreclosure on your hands, the rate's not going to help you if they dropped it down to 3%. So the question is, where are we going from here and what's the best time? Well, let's look at this next article. This is Fox Business Real Estate section published yesterday, March 21st. Let's slide this down. This is the very best time to sell if you want top dollar for your home. A gloomy 2023 gives way to a bright 2024. Why? Because the Fed is talking about possibly dropping 0.75 percentage point off the Fed rate. Now, this is from Margaret Heidenary. I apologize with her name as well, Realtor.com. We run into a lady below here with a different name. Here we have a lovely picture from Getty of a calendar, or a diary as they would call it if we were back in the old country. It says, every year, 1 week stands out from the rest as that perfect stretch of time when it's great to be a home seller. Well, that would seem to be saying it might not be a great time to be a home buyer, but we're not going to talk about that. You know, we just want to always spin the positive, right? Always be positive. And what it says is the third week in April is about peak. April 14th through 20th is the best time to sell. That is, if sellers want to see lots of interest in their home, sell quickly, pocket some extra cash, according to Realtor.com data. Now, here's what I'm thinking about this when I slide down to this picture. Back to that same old song. If the Fed cuts rates, that's a bad sign because it's showing we're headed into a weak economy. And if they raise rates, that's hard because it's hard to get a loan. It indirectly tracks to the mortgages. It's hard to get that loan for that house. So what do you have? Higher rates or lower rates? Neither one of them are great. It's the moving that is the signal that something isn't great. But back to this. What makes the third week of April a golden opportunity? Historically, median home prices are about 1% higher than the typical week. Homes also cost about 10.4% more than they did earlier this year. So it just says we've got probably 10% gain from last year over year, just 10% gain. That's pretty good gain. You could afford to be a little flexible in the transaction of your house if there was already 10% in it, plus the other year since you bought the home. You may need to be a little bit more flexible both on the buyer side and the seller side to get this done in the unlikely event that we start seeing some job losses and some bad things come about, because if you don't have a job, it's hard to pay your bill. It just says housing inventory levels and price reductions climb later in the year, says Jones, but buyers eager to buy soon may find success earlier in the spring as the market starts to pick up. People like to go shopping when it starts to warm up. They don't like the winter, and a lot of them don't like the extreme heat either. So it really does kind of get into sort of the peak of the seasonality of it. Third week in April, not a bad time to look to buy or sell a house, especially if the seller is looking at trying to get peak price and the buyer is looking at before inflation gets even worse, or they have a harder time with their qualification as credit tightens. We don't know. Sooner is better than later, and later is better than never. Now let's get to our final numbers. Hello, I'm Delbridge of Benchmark Realty, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. If you are currently unrepresented and would like to know how to compare up to 3 properties side by side and room by room, then go over to my new YouTube channel, CallDelToSell. That's 1 L and Del, no spaces. Watch the demo on Real Scout, and then call me and we'll set up your exclusive ad-free account today. All right, last week, Last week, 3/15/24, we had 18,383 opportunities. That was up over the previous period, but not greatly. We had 4219 in the under contract still showing. That was also up, but not greatly over the previous period. And the integer ratio between those two numbers remained unchanged for the third week in a row. Now, this week, 3/22/24, we have 18,549. So we're beginning to see more things open up as possibilities. It went up. We had 4315 in the under contract still showing. That also went up, and it went up by a bigger proportion because the integer ratio between the two of those, the under contract still selling, was a little bit higher at 23%. So not quite 1 in 4, but we're seeing stuff go through. So deals can be made. They're a little slower. They're a little more challenging. You need maybe a little bit more help from the agents on both sides, but we can get this done. But you need to start, especially if you want to hit that golden week of, when was it? Third week in April. We've got to get busy really fast, and we still may not hit it. We might hit the fourth week in April, but that's pretty close. We got to get working quickly. Appreciate you watching. Have a great day.